Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone who has joined us for our seminar today on the Sasanian Persian fort in the Batinah in Oman, Fulayj with Eve MacDonald. Eve MacDonald is a senior lecturer in ancient history at Cardiff University. She works on the archaeology and history of the Sasanian Empire, notably on the excavations at the Gorgan Wall in Iran, at the Dariali Gorge in Georgia, and she's currently part of a team excavating the Sohar fort in Oman. And Eve, I'm now going to let you get on with it, hoping that the technology will work flawlessly to get you on. There, it's working flawlessly.
Yay!
Okay, terrific. That's a victory for
Thank
us.
you.
And welcome to everybody. And so, Eve, you have the floor, metaphorically speaking.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Andrew. And thank you to Brendan for sorting this all out. And thank you to BIPS for having me here to talk about our little fort in the Batinah region of Oman. And I'm just going to lead off with a lot of information because as anybody in the audience knows, an archaeological excavation is never just one thing and one person. So the excavations at Fulayj fort began as part of a much larger project that was an ERC, a European Research Council funded project called the Persia and its Neighbours Archaeology of late antiquity, of a late antique imperial power in Iran. And this was directed by Professor Eberhard Sauer from the University of Edinburgh, and also by the late Professor Tony Wilkinson from Durham University. And BIPS was a very important part and an ongoing integral part of that project as well. Now, in this context, we excavated for 2 seasons at Fulayj in Oman 10 years ago now, so in 2015 and 2016. And then we spent 2 more seasons excavating just post-COVID. And those excavations were funded largely by the British Omani Society, supported by colleagues at Sultan Qaboos University in Muscat and the Omani Ministry of Heritage and Tourism. BIPS provided us with a grant to support the radiocarbon AMS dating of the samples from the final season of excavations in 2023. And these have really proved invaluable in helping us to nuance the phasing at the site and developing the occupation sequences at the fort, sort of giving us a snapshot into the life of this small fort across the late Sasanian and into the early Islamic period in Oman. The team that's listed here relates mostly to that final season of excavations, and many more people have participated over the years. In this presentation, I want to particularly thank Seth Priestman for providing many of the images and maps on the slides, although any errors or problems are entirely my own fault, not his. So what I'm going to do with the talk today is to try and put the fort in its context a little bit, mostly in the late Sasanian period, and where this sits as a marker of the pre-Islamic landscape along this Indian Ocean facing coast in Oman. I'll look at some of the excavation results and a bit of forward thinking about politics and the environment and military installations. So, on to the fort. In 2010, 2011, our colleague, Professor Nasser Al-Jawari from Sultan Qaboos University, was surveying the archaeological area of Al-Fulayj in Oman, and it's circled there on the map, as part of the Saham survey project. And in the process of doing this survey, the fort was recognized in its location, sitting upon a larger archaeological landscape that is mostly related to the Omani Iron Age. So Fulayj is this large archaeological site complex consisting mostly of Iron Age, so that's 1300 to 300 BC, remains, and it sits on an interfluvial terrace on the Wadi al-Mahmoun, just 2 kilometers from the village of Fulayj al-Harth. The site is located 13.5 kilometers from the coast at a point where the plain develops a more contoured terraced landscape towards the mountains. And you can see that in the photo on the left, what I'm talking about. So Fulayj is situated in the north of a region of Oman that's called the Batinah. And this is a 240-kilometer long coastal plain, most of which is not cultivable. I was just debating which word to use for that. But for this narrow coastal band that has long been the main focus of settlement and agricultural production in the region. So just to give you a little bit of perspective on this, the Batinah region amounts to 4% of the landmass of the current country of Oman and 50% of its agricultural output. The main city in the area is the famous early, or certainly in the early Indian Ocean, early Islamic period, it was very famous. This early Islamic Indian Ocean facing port city of Sohar, roughly 25 kilometers to the north of the fort of Fulayj. It was once the capital of medieval Oman and the site of our current and ongoing excavations sponsored by the Institute for the Study of the Ancient Cultures at the University of Chicago. And of course, one of the questions that still remains unanswered relates to whether or if there is a specific relationship between Fulayj and Sohar in its earliest phases. So the site of Fulayj was associated with this wide range of archaeological features, abandoned fields along the Wadi channel, which you can see here, if you can see my cursor down here, which appear to have been irrigated by runoff or by underwater channels known as al-Fulayj. The visible earlier features at the ridge site that sits on the edge of the wadi also includes mound tombs, which you can see here in this photograph, and irrigation canals still visible in the landscape. So the focus of our excavations was very much the fort itself, however. And its presence here, oops, sorry about that. Let's go forward. Its presence here in this larger recognized archaeological landscape from the Omani Iron Age, and I have that little table there to give you a little bit of the scale of the dates I'm talking about when I'm putting these different periods out there. So the fort is built upon an Iron Age landscape, and it leaves us with what we call a very clear occupation horizon, a gap between the two phases. So we have Iron Age and then we have Sasanian. So you can see that's almost a 600-year gap between the two. When the fort was first identified, it was apparent from the survey results, from the surface collection of the ceramics and the regular squared layout of the structure itself, that this was a site related to what we would call the Sasanian period in Eastern Arabia. So I'm using that to refer to this period that you can also refer to as late pre-Islamic too. So the Sasanian period, one of the aspects that makes this fort so intriguing for us was its uniqueness in the Omani landscape. We'll see, as I talk a little bit more about it, that the fort bears all the hallmarks of a professional military construction, and that really marks it out from any contemporary existing building tradition. That this structure at Fulayj was associated with the Sasanian period material culture here on this eastern coast, this Indian Ocean facing shore of eastern Arabia, has also added to what had been until then a sporadic Sasanian material presence from this phase of Omani history. If you look at the map a little bit, the one on the right, you can see the location of the fort within the broader context of the Sasanian lands. Also included here are other sites related to our European Research Council project, the Persian frontiers. So you can see in the northeast, just to the east of the Caspian, the Gorgan Wall, and you can also see the location of the Dariali Gorge there on the Georgian-Russian border that Andrew mentioned too. So we have this place in the south then of the Sasanian polity that really allowed us to explore the southern reaches of what we might refer to as the imperial space of Sasanian influence. A little bit of the background to other Sasanian period sites in Eastern Arabia is needed to also understand what we're talking about. So just looking at the fort within this context of the region it's found in, we have similarly dated archaeological sites within the local region of Eastern Arabia. There have been several early Sasanian period fortified elite residences identified both at Edjur and Malia in the UAE. But interestingly, these are sites that were abandoned by the late 3rd century. So the Sasanian presence is very much something that comes at the end of their existence. Moving a little bit to the north, the sites of Kush and Khat in Ras Al Khaimah represent more substantial agricultural settlements dated to the period. Perhaps most intriguingly is an island, the Jazirat al-Ghanam, in the Musandam there at the very tip of northeastern Arabia. It was excavated in 1972, and it shows stone structures with Sasanian period pottery on this very remote island, possibly representing a Sasanian outpost there right at the edge of the Straits of Hormuz. I wanted to add to this another site that isn't on the map, the ongoing excavations at Sania Island in Al Quwain, directed by Tim Power, have revealed a town, perhaps based on the industry of pearling, and a nearby Christian monastery that spans the period of the late antique and into the early Islamic occupation. So the historical framework from the Sasanian perspective of their activity in the region that they called Mazun and we're calling the northeast of the Arabian Peninsula. I just want to go through what some of the highlights of what the historical sources tell us about the nature of the Sasanian Empire's presence in this region called Mazun. Early Islamic historians, particularly al-Tabari, suggest that the Sasanians really only launched expeditions into the region when absolutely necessary. Tabari records that Ardashir mounted an expedition in the early 3rd century, followed by Shapur II in 325 AD. And of course, Shapur II is not very fondly remembered in the early Islamic historians as he who pierces shoulders. So there was not a lot of fondness towards his interventions in the Arabian Peninsula in the 4th century. Both of these campaigns have been argued, though, by scholars like Potts to have resulted in periods of formal control in Eastern Arabia, but we really don't have much scope around that of material on the ground. Of course, just the name Mazun was actually listed among the regions included in the Sasanian imperial view from their heartland. The SKZ inscription of Shapur I on the Kabai Zardasht at Nakhchi Rustam in Fars province of Iran today lists Mazun as part of the regions of the Sasanian polity. But Potts and other scholars, Derek Kennett, Brian Ulrich, have all noted that the actual nature and durability of any Sasanian control of this region remains unclear, and particularly regarding the degree to which Mazun was actually affected by the events that are recorded in the larger historical narrative. Now, the picture does seem to change somewhat under the long rule of Khosrow I in the 6th century CE. And here again, al-Tabari tells us of dynastic attempts to impose direct control on the Arabian Peninsula. And of course, he famously is reported to have led an expedition against the Himyarites, against what we call modern Yemen today. But before the 6th century, it is believed that any Sasanian influence was exercised through their client dynasty, the Lakhmids at Al-Hira in Iraq. But even here, the extent of any actual control remains very open to question. Derek Kennett very famously published an article in 2007 that really challenged any prevailing view on the Sasanian presence in Eastern Arabia. And he really notes that the archaeological and the agricultural landscape in the late pre-Islamic period was one that usually reflects decline rather than any great growth or any great input. And that's a really interesting idea because that could very well correspond with military occupation, of course. Now, on the northeast coast of Arabia in particular, there is evidence for the Sasanian period, and it is presented mostly through indirect contact and association with the late pre-Islamic period between Sasanian material culture and the population there. And that comes through literally thousands of funerary monuments along the Batinah itself and in other areas of Oman. These are often built in low elevations, flanking the edges of wadis, and it is actually through the reuse of these structures and the long consistency of the burial practices that much of our information is acquired. And here you can see a recent publication by Doppler, and it really is a fascinating analysis of these tombs, some of them built as far back as in the Bronze Age, that are consistently reused over the millennia. So during large-scale survey and excavation work undertaking in preparation for what became the Batinah Expressway, which now runs between Muscat to Rustak, Sohar, and Liwa, substantial new information was gained through the investigation of funerary archaeology in the Batinah. And the reuse of the tomb structures, these tomb structures, as I say, often built millennia before, were then redeployed in later periods. And this is reflecting two things. One is a consistency of burial practice over long, long periods of time, but also what happens in the later period is we get the interment of a number of objects from the Sasanian world in many of these burials, which is really quite a fascinating process to think about. Relatively speaking, only a small number of the graves have been excavated, and there's no doubt then that we find a fair bit of Sasanian material in these graves. They're embedded quite regularly in these later period finds. Here, especially, you can see glass, which is an indication of the frequency that the Sasanian period materials appear overall. And although the finds can't tell us a great deal about the intent intensity of any Sasanian period settlement in the region, which was really the issue that we're wanting to establish fully through the excavations at the fort at Fulayj, they do open up all kinds of other areas of interpretation that are also incredibly relevant about third space analysis, about prevailing power in peripheral areas of the Sasanian polity. So here you can see a selection of finds from tombs excavated near Rustak and Liwa, and they are really exemplar of some of the fine kinds of material we're discussing. And you can see here silver coins, carnelian and hematite seals, bronze and glass beads, and also, of course, weaponry there, like the iron sword, which is visible at the bottom. And here's some more imagery of some of the material we're talking about, and the glass vessels, glass and amber beads really stand out. So as I've said, the tomb tradition here goes well back through Omani history and clearly connects to a local semi-sedentary population. These finds present us with the fact that the local population were interacting with the Sasanian world, were able to acquire items of worth, indicating some form of high value interaction. What form that took is unclear. It may have been multifaceted. We could have military and commercial interactions ongoing. There have been some attempts to explain this in the commercial exploitation of copper mines at Arja, which is in the mountains just to the west of the Batinah, near the city of Sohar that I've mentioned, where we have evidence from radiocarbon dating that points to 6th century CE activities. So we also know there's this really interesting ongoing survey project run by Leiden University in the Netherlands called the Wadi Jizzi Project, whose results should help to even further refine and define what we can say. But overall, there is no widespread evidence of a late pre-Islamic occupation by a Sasanian Persian population on this coast, except for what we found at the site of Fulayj. And that's what makes Fulayj so interesting, really, in some ways. The reason that we keep expecting to find this evidence rests in another historical narrative, and one that is the most relevant to the story in Oman. The narrative preserved in this 10th century Omani history, written by somebody who we don't really know who they are, and they're called or referred to the pseudo al-Tabi, here translated by Harry Munt in his excellent 2017 publication that analyzes a lot of this. Goes like this, and it's important to get a look at this, I think, if we're trying to interpret perhaps what we think the fort at Fulayj was used for. So he says there was a peace treaty, a muhadana, between the Persians and the family of the al-Julanda in Oman, in which it was stipulated that there would be 4,000 asawira and maraziba, together with a tax collector, so these are soldiers, for them nearby the kings of the Azd. The Persians would stick to the coastal plain, and the Azd would be kings in the mountains, the desert, and other such places on the fringes of Oman. All affairs were to be in their charge. Any Persian member of his family or subject with whom Kisra in the Arabic or Khosrow I in the Persian became angry, or whom he perceived as a threat to his person or his kingdom, he would send to Oman to be imprisoned there. The story goes on to clarify that with the coming of Islam, the Persian population were expelled from the land, and the Julanda kings become the first rulers of this Islamic Oman. So there's no doubt then, and what this can tell us is that from a local, medieval, historical perspective and the collective memory of a pre-Islamic past, a direct intervention of a Sasanian period tax collector and mounted soldiery had formed part of the foundation narrative of the early Islamic period in Oman. So that's a long precursor to looking at our fort and what we can say about it, and if and how it provides us with any further insight into these intriguing issues of the clash between archaeological evidence and historical narrative. And what we found and excavated was a very well-built, east-facing, stone-footed square fort with projecting corner towers. It would have been limed, washed mud brick structure built on top of these stone-footed walls. And in fact, the decayed mud brick forms a substantial part of the archaeological deposit. This is a small structure with a regular plan. It measures 30 by 30 meters. The stone is not dressed, but you can see from the bottom picture there how the stones have been very carefully selected for flat faces and fine joinings with large, irregularly coursed blocks packed in with small stones and bound with lime mortar. You can also see from these photos on the slide taken from the interior of one of the trenches and also from a aerial photograph there, the flanking gates that form the entrance, the east-facing entrance to the fort. And you can see, if you look carefully, how they were narrowed at some later date. So the original structure was narrowed there to close up that entrance a little bit. The dates for the fort's construction from our radiocarbon AMS dating samples taken just beneath the wall in a narrow foundation trench correspond with the historical narrative as presented. They fit into a horizon of the late 5th or 6th century CE construction. Now, the typology of the fort fits into a much wider tradition of structures associated with military and palatial architecture at the time, with examples here from North Africa to Afghanistan. And you can see here from some examples. First of all, you're looking on the left there of the entranceway to the fort, and you can see on the top right a view to the inside of the fort from the stone walls. And then the other pictures just give you an idea of what the walls might have looked like when they were fully constructed. And overall, I wanted to show you this map, which is a multi-period map, and it shows you where the fort sits. It shows you the mound that has a much earlier burial on it. It shows you the wadi, sorry about that. And it also shows you another important fact of the fort, which is the kiln here down at the bottom that we found as well. So to the south of the fort was this industrial kiln space, a kiln site that produced lime for the fort's construction. So the lime kilns were found to the south of the fort and are connected to the construction phase of the fort. And they really highlight here the quality of the construction and also just the sheer effort that was expended in the process of building it. It suggests experienced builders who are building on a form and pretty careful planning. So altogether, we excavated multiple trenches inside and outside of the fort, which you can see here on the drawing, and with great care. And I'm not saying that because archaeology is usually not done carefully, because of course it is, but it was done extremely carefully in this environment because of what we call the limited nature of the deposit in this pre-desert landscape. In order to retain as much information as possible from a limited deposition, it meant that we applied very meticulous recording methods. And this you can see on the map, because each of these little dots is a find. And each single find, every bit of pottery that we found, every bone, Every bit of glass was measured in so that it could be plotted on a map. So their location was and their type have been all mapped in. And this is, of course, the work of the brilliant Seth Priestman, not me. So what you can see from the map here, though, is that the northeastern corner of the fort is where we found the most dense deposit. And this really allowed us to fully understand the full occupation sequence of the fort here. The deposit at the fort and in other sites like this had been impacted by what is called deflation in a pre-desert environment. So the wind and the dry environment means that the soil disappears, and this leaves multi-phases of occupation material lying on the surface all around the site, with Iron Age through early Islamic pottery scattered about. So anywhere where we could find stratigraphic deposition was approached with great care. This meant that each find, as I mentioned, was measured in situ, and that's what you're looking at down on the left-hand corner with all the flags, and it was mapped in, and it allowed us for really a full assessment of the distribution and volume of finds, and the quantification processes are visible there in some of those tables. And also just at the above left photo, you can see we're using dry sieving on site, and we also used flotation for each of our contexts, and this was to great success. So this gives you the phases of occupation of the site at Fulayj. And now we see and understand the phases. We can see that the first Sasanian period occupation on the site took place in 3 stages. And then it moves very quickly into an early Islamic period of occupation. It's been possible to identify a relatively substantial and rich occupation containing typical late Sasanian period finds sitting just below the foundation of the stone wall for the fort. So that's phase 2A. Perhaps this means there was some kind of more ephemeral structure, defensive structure there that was erected in the very initial phases, or at the wadi's edge, it had become a place of encampment in the first years of the Sasanian period. And then we find the construction of the fort proper, that's 2B, and then what seems to have been a very short period when the fort was occupied, and that's phase 2C. No, so we've noted from the shape and form, this is a professional military construction, but its small size means it's really too limited to have housed any significant military detachment. Perhaps it could have formed part of a wider defensive system designated to control the economically important Batinah plain and the Sohar hinterland in the 5th and 6th century, when perhaps a Persian population was settled in the region under the military protection of the Sasanian Empire. But as I have said and discussed, we have very little evidence other than this fort for that narrative as it is. And we see certainly, though, in our fort that the secondary fort occupation takes place from the late 6th to the early 8th century, when the Persian population seems to have disappeared and a local population occupies the fort itself. So perhaps, as our source from the 10th century comments, this fort could have been used as part of a base camp supporting a limited sized mobile force. This is envisioned as a series of cavalry units able to return when needed to a strongly protective defensive installation to shield the fertile coast along the Batinah from small-scale incursions from mobile agro-pastoralists community, or something like that is possible. Of course, the big question is, where are all the other forts that might have been connected to this? We don't have any evidence of them yet, but so this is a very hypothetical possibility. What is really interesting is what happens after the first phase and once the Sasanian period phase is over. And this was, of course, discovered in the last weeks of the 2016 excavation. It's then that we excavated in the northeast corner, and you can see the fort there in the top left, the trench that we excavated for the first time in 2016. And it was there that a secondary occupation was detected in the form of the interface of a perpendicular mud brick wall abutting onto the fort wall, and that you can see in the bottom left photograph. This just was uncovered in a small 1 by 4 meter sondage that really only presented this interface of the wall, but hinted at a whole new use for the fort in what we call phase 3, the post-Sasanian phase. So we went back in 22 and 2023, and we excavated a much bigger area in this northeast corner of the fort, which was revealing the wall's full thickness. And it shows a range of 3 completed rooms within the northeast corner of the fort that had been dedicated to domestic use in this period dated to the late 6th and to the 8th century. So we have what we consider to be the early Islamic occupation at the site, and it's lasting through to the 8th century, according to our radiocarbon dating. And if anybody out there knows and understands about this idea of the horizon that we're dealing with, of course, it's very difficult to get a specific date for this later phase, other than we know it ends by the 8th century. The sequences then of occupation are actually really well visible in this section drawing on the bottom right there. The pink highlights the pre-fort occupation, the yellow there, the foundation trench and the fort wall, a very, very small period of occupation in that dating range that we have from the 5th to the 6th. And then on top of that, we have this later early Islamic occupation as well. And one of the actual results that's so exciting from our excavations that really has, points the value of doing this incredibly careful work is the archaeobotanical material that was extracted through both excavation and flotation. We kept 40 liters of soil we retained from each context that we excavated for flotation. And you can see the amazing flotation machine there on the right-hand side with the pictures that was built by Vladimir Dabrowski from the CNRS in Paris. And these were analyzed, and they really are so interesting because they show us there was a great deal of stability over a long period of time of our occupation, and very, very interesting new species who were also imported too. And Vladimir and others recently published this in this 2024 article. And his research presents the archaeobotanical evidence for agricultural innovation across the Arabian Peninsula from antiquity to the early Islamic period. So from the mid-1st millennium BCE all the way through to the 11th century CE. And the article looks at the evidence for new crops spreading through the arid oasis agricultural systems in the Arabian Peninsula, and in particular testing aspects of Andrew Watson's very famous Islamic Green Revolution theory about the agricultural diversification during the early Islamic centuries. Of particular relevance for us is the earliest dated evidence for the presence of sorghum wheat in Eastern Arabia was found at our site in Fulayj. The evidence includes 1 whole carbonized grain, 1 fragment of a grain, and 2 earthen imprints in mud bricks. With direct radiocarbon dating of the samples, this placed the sorghum in the 8th to 10th century range of the dating, and combining that with the archaeological context in which they were found, which ends by the end of the 8th century, it can be established that the sorghum was in situ in Fulayj by the 8th century CE. Why does that matter? Some of you might not know. It is so significant because the evidence actually predates Watson's proposed timeline for the introduction of sorghum and other agricultural innovations by approximately 2 centuries. So that green revolution may well have been in place much earlier than we thought. Another thing that's really, really interesting is the presence of these earthen imprints of the sorghum on the mud bricks from Fulayj that are particularly important because using crop byproducts, things like chaff, as temper for making mud bricks typically indicates a local agricultural production. So its presence alone means the sorghum may have been successfully acclimatized to local oasis conditions by the 8th century. We see in a broader archaeological botanical analysis that Fulayj yields very traditional crops too: dates, hulled barley, wild plants. So we have this really interesting evidence from Fulayj that supports the concept of an Islamic agricultural revolution, though it dates it earlier than Watson had proposed in the Green Revolution. The introduction of sorghum is really important because it's a very drought-resistant plant. It aligns with this theory of tropical crop adoption during the early Islamic centuries. Sorghum's advantages means that it is drought resistant, it can handle water stress and things like that, but we don't need to go into it. So this study demonstrates all sorts of really cool things, obviously. And, you know, some of the Fulayj findings have allowed us to secure evidence for sorghum cultivation in Eastern Arabia, but also other things have turned up in our archaeobotanical remains that are really exciting too. Believe it or not, I'm going to talk now about termites. And found together with the sorghum samples were a number of fragments of Indian cooking pots dated to the 6th, 8th century horizon, as well as the entomological remains of a termite species that were recovered via flotation in a material from an oven dated to the 7th century CE. And this is a native species of termite from the Indian subcontinent. And the evidence then from Fulayj reveals that these termites came into Eastern Arabia by the 7th century CE, so that there was likely an industry of imported timber by that time as well. All pretty exciting. So our little fort at Fulayj continues to represent one of the most significant contexts currently known for a detailed archaeological analysis of the transformation from the Sasanian period to the early Islamic period in Eastern Arabia. It provides a small sample of evidence that hints at the implementation of hard power by actors perhaps directly linked to the Sasanian polity, perhaps a direct attempt at control in the region relating to a wider strategy by the Sasanian state. But it also tells us of early and quick expansion by the 7th and 8th centuries of new crops and species of where new crops and species of insects appear to have come across the Indian Ocean into Oman. Of course, many, many questions remain. Can this little fort really be the only one, as I've already mentioned? And also the degree to which any expansion and contact across the Indian Ocean had already been in process with the expulsion of the original inhabitants of the fort and the establishment of the early Islamic inhabitants. This reflects continuities and also a broadened scope of exchange and contact. And I think one of the things and lessons that I've learned from working at Fulayj is that sometimes when we're looking for big answers, to big geopolitical questions, we don't always find what we think we're going to find, but what we do find are new pathways that tell us about adoptions and negotiations of a local environment ongoing beneath all that big noise of history. And that's all from me. Thank you so much for listening.
That's terrific, Eve. Thank you very much. Wow, that's really good. And also, I think along the way, you managed to answer a lot of the questions that I was going to raise. So I will get right to some of the questions. We have a few. Can I ask folks who are interested in raising questions to use the Zoom Q&A function, and I will relay these to Eve. I had a couple of early-ish ones. One was a question about whether I guess, the structure related to the four-arched Bibi Mariam tomb in Kalhat.
In Kalat, yeah.
Sorry, that just
Hmm.
asking about that if there was a relation.
Possibly. I mean, this is it. It's difficult to know. I mean, Kalhat has some really interesting dates as well that are connected to the Sasanian period as well in some of the excavations there. So it's entirely possible. Yes, that's what I can say.
All right. Where is there any evidence of naval activities there? And how far, you may have mentioned it, but I missed it. How far is the fort from the water?
Yeah, the fort is 13.5 kilometers from the Saham seaside. And there, yes. So, there's a lot of shell and obviously close interaction with the sea there. But, naval, no. And of course, uh, that's our big question. How much during the Sasanian period, how much naval activity was there on the Indian Ocean facing coast would be one of the things that we don't have the answer for, but it would certainly be interesting. I mean, Tony, the Wilkinson's theories about a much more engaged, um, Northeast Arabia in Indian Ocean trade earlier, of course, and then Derek's refuting of that has all been part of the big debate. And this is ongoing, and there's a lot of work being done right now to try and understand this better and nuance it, but nothing direct that tells us anything from the fort. Yeah.
Third question here. Has there been any aerial or drone surveys undertaken to find other forts in the area if it was a chain of forts of some sort or a part of a defensive network? Has that kind of activity been undertaken?
Yes, it has, and to some degree, and certainly in at the University of Southampton, there's they do a coastal preservation project, and I know that they have been looking at some of this, and of course Durham University and the Persian and its frontiers people were all very connected to landscape archaeology. So Dan Lawrence and Kristen Hopper have done a lot of work on the mapping of the site itself and the larger landscape. But to date, we haven't found another fort connected to Fulayj. And I mean, this could be from a myriad of reasons to do with preservation and the heavy agricultural use of the area too. I mean, it is a bit of a fluke that our Fulayj sits right on top of this Iron Age site, and perhaps that's one of the reasons it was preserved. But that's the route. I think it's the route, and we've all talked about it. It's definitely the route that needs to be done. Sort of ground truthing and satellite work will be the answer, and perhaps algorithms around, size of the fort structure. It might be hiding other existing structures. That's another possibility too.
Do we have any aerial evidence of a what might be termed a road or a path network in and around the area?
No, not specifically. And there's big questions. So, because if you think about Oman and you think about the mountains, and I briefly mentioned copper and all that, and we couldn't go into that, but it could very well be that actually that's a fort protecting a vertical line into the mountains itself, and it was very much directly related to copper itself being mined in the mountains. And it could have been a fort on the sea, Fulayj, and then the mine in the mountain, rather than something that I showed running along the Batinah itself. So it's difficult to know. I think it has, to me, there must be something, because otherwise it was just this sort of weird experiment that happened in the Sasanian period to this. But we do have enough sporadic material around, and I think the Wadi Jizzi project will be really valuable in a better quantification of much more of that region to give us some insight too.
All right, I have a series of other questions. So we have one participant noting that when they visited Nizwa, they
Mm.
were told it was built on the foundations of a Parthian fort. So is there any evidence of a Parthian presence into the region?
Yeah, so no, Niwa is yes, exactly. And there's all kinds of oral historical ideas around this. And this is why I think it's so important. The cultural memory is certainly there of a pre-existing Persian Parthian presence. But the biggest I'm going to use Hellenistic for want of a word. I don't have a great word to the Parthian period or the Hellenistic period. We see at Adjur, Amlea, big growth in that period, in the sort of period post Achaemenid into Parthian period, and then with the Sasanians we have a real decline. And so certainly we don't have any evidence at Niwa for that period in terms of material culture, but it's embedded in the oral histories, and I don't know that we should completely forget that either.
Any coins found?
Coins, Parthian coins. No, I
No,
don't
no,
really.
not necessarily Parthian. Any kinds of coins.
Sasanian coins, yeah. We
Yeah.
have Sasanian period coins, definitely.
All right. Okay. Uh, right. Thank you very much for your talk. I was wondering if you could clarify why the northeastern projected tower differs in form from the other corner towers. Is this perhaps due to construction phases or functional reasons, or what?
Oh, yeah, that's really interesting. And what we actually learned in 2023, because we excavated the southeastern tower, and we saw two very different phases of construction. And again, was it and what the you sort of the tower that you see in the aerial photograph is actually we have a projecting bit of the tower underneath. Don't know, a mistake and had to be propped up somehow, but there's definitely two issues. So it could be a slight misalignment in the construction process, but we have seen that in the other towers too. It's not just the one.
Uh, Here's a question. Textual sources mention Mazun as being Oman and perhaps the Emirates in the Sasanian period. Slightly later, some Arab sources mention something El Mazuni. Where does the name come from? Maybe something to do with the Mesopotamian name Magan? Magan?
Oh, maybe. I like that's entirely possible. I mean, Mazun is the name that goes back through to Achaemenid period for the region of the northeast of the Arabian Peninsula, including Oman. And but if it is something that's Assyrian, I would believe that entirely. I think almost everything relates back to the Assyrians at some level, especially in terms of the entomology. So yeah, I'm not sure though. Yeah, if somebody knows, I'd love to hear more about that.
Uh, Another question. When the Arabs conquered, okay, I don't know all the terminology here, Ubula or Charax, they are
Hmm.
thought to have said to Omar that we conquered a port to which merchandise comes from all regions, including India and possibly China, right?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, Charax was right there, right at the mouth of the Tigris Delta. So big, huge port. Again, very, very important in the Hellenistic period, or up and through the Parthian period. The ports that are most important, we think, on the Persian Gulf side, Siraf, obviously really important, and we have so well. How much contact with China is coming through these ports is one of the big questions. And our excavations that we're doing right now at Sohar shows certainly that we have very early Chinese porcelain in the deposit right at the very beginning of the site of Sohar, which seems to be dated to the very early Islamic period. So again, if it's all appearing just like our termites and the sorghum, if it's already there, just as the society is transitioning, my assumption would be that it may already have been in process in the late Sasanian period. But again, that two problems we have is that the flat curve of the radiocarbon calibration means it's very, very difficult for us to get super precise dates on these things. So we can only get a sort of zone. And the other is the narrative. It's very difficult to know. So, and by the time, at Sohar where we're excavating, we have 8 meters of deposit to get down to the bottom. By the time we get down there, it's very difficult to find the.
Any
So
mention or any evidence of archaeological evidence for there being cobalt mines in Oman or Yemen?
I don't know.
No. Someone refers to the
That's a good question, and I don't know the
early
answer.
Islamic texts, possibly.
Oh, okay, yeah, maybe.
Here's another question about, and I was interested in this one. Where do the canals come from and go to?
Oh, the irrigation canals. So yeah, so they're related to the sort of the Fulayj systems and the oasis. So where we have nearby our site is this Fulayj village, and it's filled with irrigation canals in the oasis, and it's green and lush and beautiful. So our site most likely would have looked like that at the time. So the rain is collected from the wadi, and it's passed through all the systems. So it's very, very sophisticated kind of irrigation canals that existed all the way back into the Iron Age in as far as we can tell in the region.
Okay, we're getting a bunch more questions. We're getting close to time, but I'll see what we can do. Could you compare and contrast the Fulayj fort and any other forts in nearby Eastern Arabia, maybe Eastern Saudi and Bahrain?
I think yeah, the Kalat Bahrain is a much bigger structure, certainly. And so the 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 fort we have is much smaller at 30 by 30 meters. So while the possibility of a contemporary or near contemporary construction is there, certainly with Bahrain, the size is totally different. So the forts that we know about, the one that's interesting, as I was saying, is up in the Musan Dam, right up at the top. Um, in a way, if that is a Sasanian fort, that's quite similar. And also, what's really interesting for us there is that the ceramic typology that we find at Fulayj is very, very similar. So we seem to have a really contemporaneous event happening. If it's up at the very top, then perhaps the idea of coming around onto the Indian Ocean coast of the Arabian Peninsula was also in there. So yeah, I mean, there's lots of comparisons. I think that the work that we've done on the various regions in the Gorgan Wall, especially, but also the work that's been done on the the of course Shapur II's defensive line that's just outside of Al Hira. Can't for some reason not remembering. Um, Also shows really well constructed small forts like this. So I think they're really all over.
Uh, just based on that discussion of size, smaller and larger forts, how many people are we talking about could be there?
Well, not very many.
Yeah,
This is
I
why we
mean,
really are
yeah.
talking about it must be some kind of mobile, perhaps place where you sort of retreat into rather than occupy the rooms that we have that are in I mean, it's a small area
Yeah.
for a few families.
Mhm.
Nothing like we have no evidence for anything like big barracks or occupation forces like we do on the Gorgon Wall. I mean, there's nothing like that found inside, but then we don't have the preservation context either. So it could be
Are there any evidence of animals being there, droppings or
Yes, yes, and
horses or
bones and
camels
things
or
like that, and some of the faunal remains has been analyzed by Marjan Marshkour in CNRS, and she, yes, definitely animals around outside though,
outside? Okay.
not inside. Yeah.
Let's see. Hold on here. Any finds connecting the fort to Yemen, which we know is occupied by the Sasanians?
Not particularly. I'm sure some ceramic sequences might be similar, and certainly that's the context in which the historical analysis seems to work most clearly is that it's part of this implementation of hard power in Yemen. Might be one of the reasons that they would have extended and tried to fortify that coast.
Okay, we're now to kind of the end, so I'm going to skip a couple if I might. There was a question of the quantities of coins that might have been found.
Well, we found 0 coins at Fulayj,
Okay,
just to
right.
let you know. So
Okay,
yes,
right.
that would be nice.
Yep.
Boy, would we have liked a coin.
Good. Yep.
But no. So there's quite a few coins. The one I showed is from a Tumen Rostakar, I think, or Liwa, and the coin was the head of the skeleton was sitting on the coin. So there's a fair quantity of Sasanian coins. How's that for being vague? I'm not being very specific. I don't really have them off the top of my head, but the analysis is in that book by Stephanie Dopper of the finds and things like that. So
Right. There was a question here about why the fort was built inland and not closer to the ocean, but I think that was you sort of covered that. Here's somebody asking about the porcelain in Sohar. Is there any evidence of tang blue and white?
yeah.
Ah, Okay, there we go. That was that person. Let me see if I've got, how many people do you think the fort could support? We've kind of asked about that. Coins. Copper mines in the mountain. This is my last one. Copper mines in the mountain would suggest that these were beyond the control of the Sasanians.
Ah, well, I mean, okay, so this is it, isn't it? So, so if we believe our source, 10th century source, that the mountains are controlled by the indigenous peoples in Oman, the Sasanians and the Persians are on the coast, and there must have been a trade, and so it's the whole negotiation between the two forces. But as I was saying, that the mines near Sohar definitely have radiocarbon dates that they're active in that period, 5th, 6th century. So, there seems to be an activity, but it's if we're believing the historians, it's not Sasanian control, it's local control of the resource.
Terrific. This was really good. Flying the Sasanian flag. Excellent.
Yay!
Very, very good. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of our participants. Just a reminder that we have the talk by Arya Fani in October. There's a little publicity in that. If you're on any of our social media sites, you'll get some further announcements about that. Eve, can I thank you really very much? This is really fascinating stuff. And may I bid then closing a good morning, a good afternoon, or a good evening to all of our participants. And thank you next. And we will see
Thank
you in
you. Thanks to
October.
BIPS for helping us.
Our pleasure entirely. Thanks
All
then.
right. Take
Bye,
care.
everybody.
Bye.